Tashidele. Welcome to our third talk on this series on getting acquainted with Tibetan Buddhism. Today our talk focuses on the Noble Eightfold Path. But before we begin, let's take just a moment to do a brief meditation. Just sit with your back straight and take a deep breath or two, relax, and just rest without thoughts. In our last talk, we addressed the first teaching of the Buddha. We looked at the Four Noble Truths. So just to review briefly, the first of those Noble Truths is the truth of suffering. And we talked about various forms of suffering, but in particular this sense of dissatisfaction or imperfection that we might experience. The second one is the truth of the cause of suffering, or ignorance, which then leads to ego, and then leads to attachment and aversion, and then all various other forms of suffering that we experience in our lives. And then the truth of the cessation. It doesn't have to be that way. And finally, then, the fourth noble truth is the truth of the path, the Eightfold Path, the topic of our discussion today, the means to attain enlightenment and escape from that suffering. And we talked about it in terms of three trainings. There's the training on ethics, those actions that are helpful to us along the path, and then meditation, training our mind, and finally the transcendent wisdom aspect of this. And so those are the basic framework within which we find these eight actions that we can do on the Eightfold Path. So in terms of the ethics, those helpful actions, helpful conduct, we have right speech, right action, and right livelihood. In terms of meditation, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And finally, in terms of wisdom, we have right understanding or view and right thought. So let's begin. And I want to begin this in the first part on conduct, or looking at virtuous kinds of actions that we can do. What is beneficial to us in terms of enlightenment? Ethics, as I mentioned before, typically has to do with right or wrong. In Buddhism, it has more to do with what is helpful to us in our practice, helpful to us in attaining enlightenment. So I'm going to begin actually with the last of the Eightfold Path, the first, that being right thought. Right thought leads to right speech, which leads to right action or conduct. And so I think that's a good place to begin, but we will return to it at a different level of discussion, the wisdom aspect, in a few minutes. So one of the aspects of right thought is having good thoughts about others. Very simple kind of thing for us to do, as well as for ourselves. We are not excluded from that. One of the important aspects of right thought is bodhicitta. Bodhicitta means the mind of enlightenment. And bodhicitta has several different aspects. The first aspect that we engage in is the altruistic intention. The intention to attain enlightenment to benefit all sentient beings. So this aspiration, this goal that we have, is where we begin. And then based on that goal, we do the second part, which are action bodhicitta. Actions that we actually take, loving kindness and compassion and so forth. We talked about the four immeasurables. Loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. Or there are practices for equalizing self and others. So we see everybody from that point of view of equanimity. Or in addition, there are practices in terms of exchanging self and other, walking in the other person's shoes, or at least perceiving what it might be like to be in their shoes. And then another practice which is very popular is Tong, giving and taking, in which we look at the other individual that we perceive as suffering, and we breathe that in as a smoky, dark substance. It goes down to our heart, which transforms it into warm white light, and then we breathe that back out to the other person. So with each breath, we take it in, purify it, and breathe it out in that purified form to help others. Everything is perceived as being interrelated, interconnected, and interdependent. And that interdependence is a very important concept within Buddhism. And so in terms of right thought, it's important to be aware of the interconnection that we have with all things, all people, all other sentient beings in this world, this universe, the multi-universes that may exist. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about it as interbeing. Interesting word for that. So let's move on then to right speech. Right speech then talks about speech that we should avoid. We talked about this in terms of the 10 non-virtuous actions to avoid. And it also talks about 10 virtuous actions in which we should engage. So we want to avoid things like lies and malicious comments, harsh language, gossip, and so forth. The speech that we want to use that benefits us then are things like honesty, loving speech, and helpful, nurturing speech. Compassionate listening is a part of speech. And so those are things that are actually helpful to us. So we need to be mindful about those, what we're doing, how we're doing it, and engage in those kinds of actions and avoid the others. This then leads to right action or conduct. These are not laws, as in some religious traditions, but these are things that are helpful to us in terms of achieving enlightenment. We talk about doing good, or at least do no harm. And in the Bodhisattva path, do good, or at least no harm, for the benefit of all sentient beings. And there, again, going back to the 10 non-virtues and virtues, are things that are helpful and non-helpful that are listed in there. In terms of unskillful or non-virtuous kinds of actions, there are things like killing, taking what is not given, or stealing, sexual misconduct, and other harmful actions. So we want to avoid those harmful actions, and instead we want to use skillful actions, things like protecting life, helping others, giving to others, generosity, and loving others, or other gentle and caring kinds of actions. So we want, as a part of this, to pay attention, to be mindful of what our actions are. And going back to the first, the thought, so we pay attention to what we're thinking, what we're saying, what we're doing. So being mindful of all of those things with respect to body, speech, and mind. That leads to the third one in this category, which is right livelihood. So the Buddha was obviously talking about lay practitioners, or householders in this case, because monks and nuns don't have livelihoods. And so he was broadly addressing those who are like us, you and me, with jobs and so forth. And so here he talks mostly about employment that does good, or at least does no harm. So there are certain kinds of things that are to be avoided, things like scheming, belittling, and usury kinds of things. In some cases, teachings talk about business more broadly, all kinds of business. I don't think that it's necessarily that business is bad, but it certainly can be. We need to be aware of those kinds of things. There were also some rather proscribed things to avoid, professions, things involving weapons, intoxicants, poison, killing, cheating, prostitution, and slavery were prohibited. In terms of work to do, we look at helping professions, things that are beneficial to others. So things like doctors and teachers and social workers fall into that category. So being socially responsible is a part of that, as well as ethical and a sense of community. Now we can do that in business as well, so that doesn't mean that we have to avoid business. That would eliminate most jobs. And we need businesses, and we need the kinds of services and products that businesses provide. But they need to be done in an ethical, in a moral manner, and a way that is helpful. That gets us then to the second category of meditation, and 3 actions that are helpful in terms of meditation. The first one being right effort, diligence, or joyful effort, if you will. We need to make this a joyful activity. We're not going to meditate if it's not something that is fun or joyful in our lives. We also need patience and persistence as a part of that. So we need to stay with it. It takes a while. It took the Buddha 6-7 years to attain enlightenment, and it took most of the great Mahasiddhas 12 years or more to attain enlightenment, so it can take a while to do this. We need to be patient with that, but at the same time persistent. We need not lose faith in the process as we move along. So we do this through mind training, mindfulness and awareness. And so we will talk about meditation, mindfulness, and so forth in just a moment. But among these are the 4 thoughts that turn the mind that we mentioned previously: precious human birth, impermanence, our death, along with that, the law of karma, and the suffering of samsara. So these are important thoughts to keep in mind, to remind us of why we were doing this practice, and to stay motivated to do the practice, to use the time that we do have available as practice. And then restraining and abandoning unwholesome mental states and actions. Again, it goes back to the kinds of things that are listed in those 10 non-virtuous and virtuous action lists. And then developing and preserving wholesome mental states and actions. So the ethics, again, is a very important part of this in terms of right effort. The number 5 is right mindfulness. I've mentioned that a couple of times already. Paying attention to the present moment, what's actually happening right now with our body, speech, and mind. But this can happen at different levels, if you will. For example, ordinary mindfulness, we might call it, is the kind of thing that we regularly do, or in more cases don't do, where we barely notice. We're like running around on automatic pilot, if you will, preoccupied with other kinds of thoughts. Occasionally, perhaps, we do have some mindfulness, some awareness of what's going on. At another level, there's present moment mindfulness, where we really are paying attention to what's going on in the present moment, at least in terms of body, speech, and or mind. We may not be paying attention to all of them at the same time. That's a little more challenging to do. So there are practices in the tradition of contemplating form, the 5 aggregates, and form being the first of those. So form, feelings, perceptions, thoughts or mental formations, and consciousness. And so we can go through and contemplate these, the first one being form as our body, and then we can do it in terms of contemplating other kinds of form as well. We can contemplate feelings, the second of the skandhas, and what's going on with the things that we feel: anger, jealousy, love, compassion, and so forth. Another level would be different forms of looking at mental phenomena as opposed to the more physical aspects. So contemplating our perceptions, the seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting, paying attention at that level very carefully as we go about the things in our day. And then contemplating our states of mind, mental formations, the thoughts themselves that we have, and the emotions that we experience as a part of that. So all of those can be a part of our contemplation to increase our level of mindfulness as we go about doing things throughout the day. And by doing that, everything becomes meditation. It's not just 20 minutes on the cushion each day. It's whatever time we spend in formal meditation, but it's also 24/7, around the clock. We're always in a meditative state, if you will, by paying attention, by being mindful in what we do. That leads us then to right concentration. In order to do that, we need to be able to focus. Single-pointed calm abiding, or shamatha. And we do that in a formal way, but that then helps facilitate what we do the rest of the day. As you recall, we talked in the beginning about stages of preparation that people went through at the time of the Buddha, and some of these certainly apply for us as well. The preparation phase, they would engage first of all in ethics, and then in stillness, and then in breath control. So they went through these phases to prepare for the actual meditation. And then the first phase of meditation, the jhanas, where they had experience of calm happiness, withdrawal of senses, a sense of the ground of being, and eventually no thoughts at all. And then beyond that, we had the second phase of the ayatanas, the vast openness, the awareness of awareness, the sense of nothingness, and then finally one that they called neither perception nor non-perception. And the Buddha incorporated those into his instructions on meditation as well. And the final phase is the cessation of ignorance, of feelings and perceptions. And so we get to this final phase as a part of that in terms of our concentration as well. The practices in Tibetan Buddhism, certainly shamatha that we have talked briefly about, we'll come back on one of the talks is on shamatha. The deity practices, particularly the generation stage practices, where we visualize ourselves as a deity, is another way of improving our ability to concentrate, to focus our attention. And in Dzogchen, particularly the Trukcho practices in Dzogchen and the Mahamudra practices also fit into that. The goal is to be able to place our mind on something and leave it there, let it rest undistracted in any way for whatever period of time that we want. It can be hours, it can be even days. There are not very many people that can do that level of concentration, but we do improve and we get better and better at that. Then part 3, we get to the wisdom aspect, the wisdom training. Here, number 7 is the right understanding or view. We sometimes refer to as emptiness. We talked before about the root cause being our innate ignorance, that leading to a concept of self, the ego, if you will, and that leading then to attachment and aversion of various sorts, which then leads to all kinds of different things that the Buddha talked about as suffering. It's not that everything in our life is suffering, but that there are many things in our life that create dissatisfaction or more direct forms of suffering, pain, mental anguish, and so forth. So it's important that we understand the nature of reality, what he called shunyata, or emptiness, as a part of that. Sometimes we refer to it as suchness, or thatness, or isness, because one of the things that he described about this was that it's ineffable. It's beyond words. We can't really describe it. We can talk about it in a way, but it's really the direct experience that is important here, not the words themselves. If we get caught up in the words, then we lose the real meaning, the real direct experience that it is about. So there are concepts of emptiness, many actually, in the tradition. And one of those is in Madhyamaka, the Middle Way teachings. In the Middle Way, Nagarjuna talked about his tetradilemma, a 4-part dilemma. Emptiness is not a thing. It is not nothing or no thing. It is not both, and it is not neither. So in the process of identifying all of those, he's eliminated all the logical explanations of what emptiness might be. It's not a thing, so we can't describe and say it is this. The logical thing would be to say, well, if it's not this, it must be nothing. But he says, no, it's not nothing either. Well, what if maybe it's some trick question? There's some combination of both. No, it's not both. Well, then is it just neither? No, it's not neither either. It's just that direct experience. And sometimes then was referred to as the emptiness of emptiness, to go beyond the concept of emptiness that we have to the direct experience of emptiness. And various practices that help us along the path in this process. Special insight or vipassana meditation is a very important part of that. The completion stage of the deity yoga practices are oftentimes also described as being a part of that process. Or Togao in the Dzogchen practices is another way of helping us with the wisdom aspect of that. So we need to recognize the nature of self and phenomena and mind and so forth, and then encounter that direct experience that I've been talking about. That brings us back to number 8, where we started actually with right thought. Here we're talking about it at a little different level, the nature of mind. And here, one analogy that we can use for this is a mirror. A mirror reflects things, but the mirror itself is not the reflection. So that's like the nature of mind, is like the mirror. And the things that we have in mind, the things that arise in our mind, are like the reflections. But you can't have a mirror without reflections. It simply wouldn't be a mirror. And you can't have reflections without the mirror. And so they're interdependent, they're related to each other. And so the nature of mind and the manifestations in mind are very closely related, intertwined with each other as a part of that. But the nature of mind itself is actually beyond thoughts. So thoughts and phenomena spontaneously arise out of this nature of mind, just as the reflections in the mirror. And from that, we develop what we call pure view or sacred outlook. We begin to see everything as being sacred, or pure view, which is described as all sentient beings appearing to us as Buddhas. That doesn't mean in a literal way, but we perceive them as being Buddhas. We know that they have the innate Buddha nature inside them, even if they are behaving in ways that may not be very Buddha-like at the time. So we perceive everything as, all beings, as a Buddha, and this includes not only human beings but other sentient beings as well, birds and animals and fish and so forth, insects, all of those kinds of things are perceived as being Buddha. So it changes our worldview. All sounds are perceived as mantras, the speech of the Buddhas. All thoughts are perceived as the wisdom of the Buddhas. And all other phenomena are perceived as being a Buddha field, a special Buddha realm. And so we are living in this Buddha realm. This is a Buddha realm in which we live. So that concludes our overview of the Eightfold Path, or Noble Eightfold Path. Our next talk will be on karma. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and we'll return